Hi everyone, I'm Lalit Choda, excited to be joining CSA's NHI Summit. Today I'm going to be talking about humans and now agents and how the NHI threat has amplified. But before we start, just a very quick intro. I'm the founder of the NHI Management Group. After 30 years running large global NHI, PAM, IM programs at various investment banks, in 24, I decided to found the NHI Management Group to evangelize, educate around the topic of NHIs, and now obviously Agentic AI, published some big guides like the Ultimate Guide to NHIs, and along the way, I've now been given the nickname in the industry, Mr. NHI. Okay, so look, I'm going to tell you three real stories that have occurred in the industry and really why I think the internal threat when it comes to NHIs is now becoming much, much bigger than it was previously. I do a normal keynote talk on a practitioner's guide to managing NHIs, where I talk about an incident that occurred at a financial institution that started a large NHI program. So I'm going to start with that and just recap on that. Some of you maybe heard me talk about previously. I'm then going to sort of fast forward 4 or 5 years to kind of the current state, where we obviously have now the new world, with vibe coding, shadow AI, and AI agents, and like what we're seeing kind of in the wild, and also with my own personal experiences. And then to kind of recap, really want to sort of highlight that, look, I think organizations really need to think about the internal threat. I think it's dramatically changed. It was always there with NHIs, and I think it's now just got much, much bigger. Okay, so let's start with something that happened about 5, 6 years ago. So I was working in a large financial investment banking institution. I've been talking to my CISO and head of IM for a number of years about the fact that they needed to fix their NHI issues. But at the time, the priority was to focus on human and PAM. And then I get a call one day from my CISO and the head of IM, and they said, Lalit, we feel there's been a major issue that's occurred, a business impacting issue, where someone has inappropriately used a non-human identity, and it's caused huge, huge ramifications. Can you help look into it and try and mitigate the risk? So I start investigating. Clearly, the issue was someone in IT was trying to do some update in UAT, but accidentally ran their SQL query using an NHI credential with a password and accidentally connected to production, and then the updates that they executed caused significant business impacting issues. So we start talking to the team and say, look, you need to fix this issue. You need to cycle your password for this NHI on the database. And the first challenge was we don't even know, where we have source code that's referencing this credential. It could be in many places. Our passwords are typically hard coded, and along the way, this app's been around for 10 plus years. We have maybe given out the credentials to other application teams, upstream, downstream teams that want to use our database to connect and either provide data or extract data. So therefore, the problem gets much, much bigger. Not only do we need to ask the application team in question, right, that's got the issue, we also have to now find out who else is using those credentials. So we then have to implement some scanning capabilities, some monitoring capabilities with our DBAs, and we're able to kind of at least work out, which source code is being used for these credentials within the main business app. And then by turning on monitoring controls on the database, we were able to see the different IP addresses coming in, connecting using the same identity and credentials. And we were able to find roughly another 8 applications that were using the same credentials. So now we've got a huge problem that we've got, multiple applications all sharing the same credential, password. It's hard coded in many different scripts, in many different places. Our CIO at the time said, look, we need to cycle this password within um, 24 hours, but it actually took 3 weeks to do. Each kind of team that was sharing the credential had to then move to their own brand new credential on that database, find all their places where the source code had hard coded this credential, and then obviously migrate those changes from initially UAT and then into production, and then the same for the main application in question. So as you can imagine, this took a huge amount of time, many man days of effort across many different teams, a lot of coordination through myself and our various infrastructure teams, DBA teams, DevSecOps teams. And as I said, it took 3 weeks to just cycle one password. So let's just recap, what were the control issues with this incident? Clearly, issue number one, a human using an NHI account, clear lack of environment segregation. The account or the identity had been set up with the same identity on both the production and non-production databases, obviously hard-coded plain text credentials in source code, sharing of credentials, and then clearly a lack of monitoring controls. No one knew that IT staff were using these credentials and bypassing sort of standard PAM controls. And then finally, there were no requirements within this organization to cycle passwords. If there was more regular cycling requirements in place, maybe that could have mitigated some of the risks and probably uncovered some of the issues with sharing as well. So what happens next? My CISO says, the project that you'd been talking about for years, we need to start it straight away. And that was the start of a 5-year program where I established, put in place an end-to-end program to mitigate the risks and address some significant global regulatory requirements from many financial regulators across the world. $20 million program, as I left, it was still running um, and took over about 5 years to address over 100,000 credentials. Now, look, I'm sure this story is familiar to many. Um, some organizations have started to get a handle of this. But look, let's now fast forward 4 to 5 years. What are we dealing with now? Right? We're not now dealing with, a human that knows the credential for a non-human identity that's unmanaged, unmonitored, and can potentially cause production impact. And we've all seen these accidents occur. But now, in the world of AI era, we've got shadow AI, we've got vibe coding, we've got agentic AI. These agents, right, end up getting access to things that you didn't intend that they were supposed to have access to. Clearly, because of their autonomous nature, they will be goal orientated and will take paths that you never kind of expected or designed for. And typically, these agents will have, limited guardrails in place. So look, I would say, look, the insider threat that I always called out for many years as massive and people underestimated, I think, has got significantly bigger. And now folks have got co-pilots that can take your instructions and can learn and explore and cause even more risks within the organization. So look, I'm now going to take you through two examples, right, that are fairly recent. One is a personal story. So I, like many, have been doing vibe coding using tools like Claude and using them quite heavily, as we've been doing some refinements to our group's capabilities. Um, so this is a second story. I was trying to make some changes to a particular database table. I wasn't happy with some of the enumerations that we'd set up on a particular table, and I'd been talking to Claude and said, look, I want to refactor the the database table and rename a couple of enumerations to different values. Claude says immediately, yes, I can do that for you, gave me some SQL. I executed it without really thinking through the implications myself. I kind of assumed, you know, the vibe coding tool would know what it's talking about, and I ran the SQL, and next thing I know, half my data, or maybe a little bit more, has been wiped out. Turns out that if you rename an enumeration, all the data that's mapped to that enumeration will get blown away. So luckily, this was work that was still in development. I had, prior backups, and I was able to recover relatively quickly. Clearly, if this was in production, the impact would have been more severe. So I then started talking to Claude and said, look, this is terrible. What you've done, what you've caused. Look, what do you now propose as the fix? It then says, look, let's update all the data, right, to the new enumerations, right? So it has a temp two, and I'm thinking that doesn't make sense, right? You can't update to a new enumeration that doesn't exist in the database. So clearly, attempt two was terrible as well by the vibe coding agent. And then finally, I start telling it, look, I don't think your approach is right. You need to maybe add to new enumerations to the existing ones, then do the updates, and then clean up the old enumerations. And then, surprise, surprise, the vibe coding tool fully agreed with me. So look, here's a real personal example that could have again caused some significant issue. I'm sure you and your colleagues will, really attest to this kind of within your own organizations. I'm sure you've got hundreds of folks that are using these vibe coding tools to do development, to help with deployment, maybe even do things in production as well. Clearly, you can see, you're no longer, in control of this yourself. You're kind of giving away control and relying on, a vibe coding agent to actually do a lot of the work for you, and you're assuming it knows what it's doing. But clearly, if you trust vibe coding tools, like with just AI in general, clearly it's prone to making mistakes. Now, another incident that occurred that I'm sure many of you may have heard of was the Pocket OS incident that occurred maybe about a month, 6 weeks ago. This was a SaaS product, right, that deals with car rentals, reservations, right? So again, one of the team members was doing some routine maintenance work, trying to fix some bug kind of within their staging environment, and they let the vibe coding tool, the agent, loose, and it decided to take a different path to what the operator expected. Rather than using some of the credentials, it actually found an API token that was unrelated to the actual fix that was needed to be made within kind of the staging environment. When it got access to a credential that was used for domain management of the railway platform as a service product. And this API key basically had full privileges, right, to the whole railway's entire API capabilities. The agent then decides, right, without any kind of human checking, to execute a volume delete command. What happens next? 9 seconds later, all the data is wiped, all the backups that are on the same volume also wiped again. Significant impact to the customers that can then make reservations. And then as you start talking, or the Pocket OS team starts talking to the agent, right, it's clearly admitted, right, that yes, deleting a database volume is destructive, shouldn't be done, that the operator never asked for anything to be deleted. It should have checked, and in reality, it didn't understand what it was doing, but it knew the rules, right, and it violated, every one of them. So this example, the one I gave from personal experience, I'm sure many of you have seen this so much, right, as you've been playing with the AI tools, the vibe coding tools, the agents. So clearly now, as you can see, the internal risks, I think personally, are going to far outweigh, or the internal threat risks are going to far outweigh the risk you've got with external threat actors. The fact that we would always see accidents occurring internally within an organization, sometimes maybe malicious, sometimes accidental. I think my prediction is we're going to see significantly more of these issues occurring within organizations, and then through obviously sort of highly distributed, fragmented environments, with our SaaS interconnected worlds, multi-cloud, on-prem. So look, really, I think, the insider threat problem has now just had a big upgrade. I think, as an organization, you really need to think seriously about what controls, what policies, what standards, how you're enforcing kind of best practices to manage, the AI era, be it vibe coding, be it shadow AI, be it, agentic AI systems that are obviously by design autonomous in nature. Now, clearly, in the three examples that I shared, the intent was clear. Scenario one, someone wanted to do an update just in UAT. Scenario two, they were trying to change the enumerations. And in scenario three, someone was trying to fix something in staging. So clearly the intent was appropriate, but clearly the access or the fact that there were inappropriate controls, weaknesses in managing kind of the underlying non-human identities in all those three cases meant that huge impact occurred. So it's interesting, all the things that I talk about, when I talk about non-human identity risks around sharing of credentials, overprivileged credentials, those were clear in all the examples. You take the Pocket OS example, that one credential had full privileges, right? So we always talk about things like least privilege. So again, as you move from dealing with just the regular kind of NHIs to now kind of the AI era with agentic AI, those core NHI principles still hold and matter. And it's really important that you really first step back before you build your agentic infrastructure and make sure you've got a solid foundation for how you manage NHIs. And we've got some great guidance that we'll share at the end around how you should do that. Clearly moving away from static credentials, API keys to dynamic ephemeral credentials are also key, and those are obviously, clear in some of those examples that I shared. Clearly, agents can inherit your blast radius. They can take your, privileges and use that through delegation. But now they operate, with machine speed and scale. So clearly, in that example at the end, with Pocket OS, 9 seconds, and the damage is done. Now, clearly, people think, well, look, I've got some guardrails in place, I've got some prompts, I've given some guidance to my agent or my vibe coding tool on how to follow best practices. But I'm sure you, like many of us, including myself, have found, you give instructions to an agent or a vibe coding tool, right? But they're just guidance, right? They're not enforced. And many times I've had arguments with Claude to say, well, like I told you, you can't do X, you can't do Y, but it still ignores kind of my instructions. So really, your kind of guardrails, have to be outside of the model, outside of the agent. In summary, right, I would say, look, your insiders, right, are now going to be much more dangerous, right, than they were before. They don't really have a conscious, right, like we do from, a human standpoint, right? They're autonomous, they've got access to production, and clearly agents, these vibe coding tools, have no concept of the consequences of their actions. So finally, what are the key thoughts, takeaways? Look, I'm sure most of you have seen some of these guidance recommendations before, but look, for security leaders, I think you need to start with the basics, right? What's out there? What agents are running? Where are they? What do they have access to? And more importantly, what's the worst thing that could happen with these agents, right, if they are left unsupervised? So I think as you start deploying your agent infrastructure, it's got to be controlled. You've got to do it in a staggered way. You need to understand, what the agents are doing. What have they got connectivity to? What are they using? Are they using static credentials? Are they using dynamic credentials? How autonomous are they? And look, I think whatever organizations had around modeling insider threats, right, that model's now out the water. It's obsolete, right? You kind of assumed, intent. Humans would hesitate. They would think, right? They would think about, well, I need to comply with my policies, my standards, my controls, follow best practices for coding, deployment, testing. But that's all again out the water, right? When you're using various AI tools and agents, right? So now you've got to be concerned about the shadow AI problem that's going to exist and growing. And now you've got an army of people, right, that don't have experience in sort of software development, software security, software development lifecycle that are spinning up, uh, many agentic solutions, right? And clearly, those folks have no kind of real education on how to build these things securely. Unfortunately, kind of some of these tools are not currently secure by design. Some of the standards, the best practices around dynamic, ephemeral credentials, things like runtime, authorization, these are all things that are kind of still developing, right? So I think it's really critical, if you're in a leadership role, to make sure you've got solid controls around, deployments, and then you're fully reviewing kind of the agents end to end, what they can do, what they can see, what's the worst case that can occur, and once they're deployed, you need to continuously monitor them to see what they're doing. I think if you're on the practitioner side, well, clearly our view is every AI agent is really a non-human identity, but it's a new class of non-human identity. Clearly the big difference is it's autonomous, right? But still, these need to be governed, and I would argue now probably need to be governed much more than you would have historically governed your regular NHIs, your static workloads, because there they were very fixed. We knew what they were doing, we knew what access they had. Now with obviously agentic AI, access now needs to be granted, not kind of runtime, initiation time. It's now action time, based on intent and context. You need to decide what access is appropriate. So I think now practitioners, you need to really step back and think about what is your core NHI foundation, and then how are you building on top of that for the agentic AI world. Clearly, things like real-time authorization are going to become foundational. Clearly things like kill switches are important, and if you see something's gone out of control, you need to be able to stop it. But I think it's always the same basics, right? It's all about identity. It's all about what can do, and it becomes all about authorization now, but more in a real-time model. And look, if you can't finally audit what these agents are doing, you can't monitor what they're doing within your organization, are they doing appropriate things? What are they connecting to? Have they taken paths that you were expecting? You're never going to be able to govern and understand the risks around the agent. So I hope this has been a bit of an eye opener for you that are listening. I'm sure you've definitely heard about some of those issues, but really, I think it comes home when you see three real life examples, two of them from practitioners that's been dealing with NHIs for nearly 25 years, that now educates, evangelizes about the topic. And I'm really concerned about the insider threat. And if there's one thing you should take away, it's that be concerned about the insider threat more so than the external threat. Now, hopefully we may have some time for some questions, but in closing, I'm just going to share some resources from our group. We have the most comprehensive, independent knowledge center on NHIs and AI agents. We launched a number of months ago the most comprehensive and only accredited CPD training course on NHIs, including agents. And we've got over 10,000 articles, FAQs, discussion forum, all about NHIs and Agentic AI. So there's a huge amount of information out there. This space is moving really, really fast. I think it's important you stay abreast of what's going on. I hope you learn not just from this session, but all the other great speakers and sessions in this summit, and make sure you attend some of the other big events that our group and others are hosting to really help your organization deal with what I think now is the biggest risk exposure that firms are going to have now in a lifetime. A few years ago, I used to say managing NHIs was the hardest problem that you'll ever face, and I'm now having to kind of eat my words and say, well, now agents are going to be the toughest problem to handle, and if you don't get these properly governed, managed with the appropriate controls, you'll be the next organization dealing with some internal incident, accident. All right, I hope you enjoyed my talk. Any questions, feel free to get hold of me offline, ping me on LinkedIn, or find us on nhimg.org. For that, thank you very much.